padanje je dobra beseda. Lahko jo razumemo različno, kot poletni kamor, kot odklon od moralne norme, ki konsolidira družbo, kot odpad od civilizacije, izpad iz človeškega gnezda. V bistvu gre za to, da si kriv. Veš po bolečini, ki je ne moreš zanikati, ne zamenjati s čimerkoli drugim. Pripadati temu mi je mučno. A morda ima samo to zdaj smisel. Stigma, boleče znamenje kolektivne udeleženosti, še vedno lahko postane izhodišče, začetek poti od slepega mi k družbi sestavljeni iz jazov, ki vidijo. A to lahko naredimo le od znotraj.
Dober večer na novem literarnem večeru festivala Fabula v Cankarjevem domu. Today we host Maria Stepanova, an award-winning Russian author who is considered one of the most important literary voices of post-Soviet Russia. Good evening and welcome.
Good evening and thank you so much for inviting me. It's an honor.
Dobri večer.
Dobri večer.
So in the book of essays, Zone strani, which was prepared specially for the Fabula Festival, you inventively interpret the authors who shaped you, thus following in your own way the slogan, "What shapes us," which the Fabula organizers set as a festival landmark this year. So my first question would be, what shaped you?
Well, obviously the list is rather long. But to stay at least with the authors I am trying to converse with in this book, I would start with W.G. Sebald, the German writer that was and is a figure of crucial importance for myself. Maybe Marina Tsvetaeva, the Russian poet, with her highly ethical approach to poetry as a way of structuring a different order for life. And maybe Susan Sontag, which is more maybe of a personal influence than a writerly one, but as a figure, she means a lot for me.
You mentioned all the authors you mentioned in your book of essays, Zone strani. Some of them we will point out further in our conversation. You were born into a Russian Jewish family. There were more Jews in the family. Only the grandfather who gave you and your father your last name was Russian, like Stepanov, Stepanova. But for a long time, you did not consider yourself either a Russian or a Jewish writer. You wanted to have a voice of your own. Actually, since the beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian war, you said in this book of essays, Zone strani, since the beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian war, when asked, "Who are you?" you answer, "A Russian writer." How come?
It is a hard question, and the reality it is dealing with is even more hard. So forgive me if I'll be, well, a bit longer than it takes to answer some other questions. The thing is, when you are writing books that it is not so easy to describe, critics, booksellers, publishers necessarily are looking for the way to compartmentalize you, to put your work, to put yourself on a certain shelf. And it is easy to associate the author with the community she is coming from. So this approach, well, a shelf with Jewish literature, for instance, a shelf with Russian literature, it feels sort of natural. But I always wanted to to regard myself as a standalone human, so to say, as a person who wants to be responsible for herself, for her words, for her images, for her decisions. And, well, for the majority of my lifetime, it was possible. But the language I'm speaking, the community I'm coming from, and its decision, if sometimes, well, most of the time, I cannot really influence these decisions, but I am a part of the structure, an unwilling part, an opposing part, a dissenting part maybe, but still I'm a part of this community. And so to refrain from calling myself a Russian in this situation, in the situation of a full-blown aggressive war of Russia against Ukraine, would be, well, denying myself a responsibility which I'm ready to take, which is defining my existence currently.
So you open your book from the other side, Zone Strani, with the Russian question, which questions the position of Russia and Russian identity, which brought death and pain to Ukraine. How do you, as a Russian intellectual, view the war in Ukraine, or you as being just you without this Russian identity?
I was writing about that right at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, and I didn't think that in this regard something has changed. Maybe just the fact that this war is an ongoing one. It is taking lives, it is taking time, it is taking, well, it is occupying even more space in our lives and our imagination. It is defining everything. But from the very beginning, it was quite clear for me that it is the situation where the delineations are very much defined. For me, it is still clearly a war of good against, of good and evil. And, well, Russia, in this case, is representing the evil. As simple as that. But it feels true.
You're a recognized poet, and even in your essays, you do not give up these lyrical moments, even in these socially critical passages. What does this noun of language mean to you?
I would say that maybe because I've started writing as a poet in quite an early age, so language was even more important for me because the process of conversing with the language, of being involved into this two-sided relationship, a person and a language. So everything is somehow gathered with me, as it happens with poets, around just one crucial question I cannot answer, and it would be hard for me to formulate it. So it feels like a void, an enormous void, and I'm making circles, making rounds around it, trying to answer the question, or at least to find out what the question is. And sometimes I need different means for answering the questions, the question or seeing it. So sometimes I'm trying to answer by the way of writing poetry. Sometimes it is prose, sometimes it is essays. But mainly I am still obsessed with the same enormous thing. And so, of course, the language and the approach, I am trying to make them different, but of course they have to overlap because the person behind the question is the same.
If you were to choose between writing essays and poetry, is it like an impossible choice?
It is interesting. Well, of course, if I had to choose, of course I would be choosing poetry because it feels the most natural. But I would prefer not to have a choice because as time goes by, I understand that the relationship between myself and poetry and myself and prose is maybe different. Poetry is something that is possessing you. There is a famous metaphor. Rilke is, Rainer Maria Rilke is proposing, he is speaking of poetry as a rider that mounts a horse. So a poet is a horse that is carrying forward this person of poetry. So you are transporting poetry from the point A to the point B, and then you're letting it go. So it is poetry that chooses you, not the other way around. And with prose, you are free to have your own choices. And sometimes it can work as an escape room, or maybe as a window that in another world that you can open and take a good long breath. So I would prefer to be able to write prose, at least for a while.
You are currently living in exile. You were for quite a few years living in Berlin, in Germany, and now you're in Paris. How come?
Well, actually, it is a practical issue. I'm on a fellowship that is lasting for a year until until this summer, and then I'm coming back to Berlin. So it is a practical necessity, but I'm glad to be in Paris for a while because, well, in the Russian emigre circles, there is a tendency of perceiving us and our situation and as something unique, which is deeply untrue. Not only because nothing is unique about the idea and the situation of exile, displacement, whatever, but we're always comparing ourselves and our stance with the Russian emigration of the first wave after 1917, for instance, or, well, at least with the German immigration of the 1930s. But the waves of emigration that were rolling through Paris since the beginning of the 19th century and on and on. And it never stops. And it is the same with Berlin, for instance. The Syrian diaspora, the Iranians, the Iraqians. I mean, there is such a universe of displacedness. And Paris somehow works as a constant reminder that you are not unique. You are just simply alive. And there is a big ground for comparisons.
Since living abroad, how do you see the situation in Russia nowadays? On Sunday, on the 17th of March, there will be elections in Russia. Putin has been in power for almost 25 years now. He's also running this time.
Well, I'm quite, well, I've long stopped being optimistic when it comes to Russia and its future. Of course, I would love to have some degree of hope for something to happen, but that's something I cannot even imagine, because all the logical chains, all the possible predictions I am able to conceive and describe are leading us from bad to the worse. So I cannot foresee a logical solution, at least within the next few years. So for me, the elections are, as they used to be for the last 20 years or more, just one more stage in a, well, huge farce that is getting repeated and repeated with every Putin's presidential term. So no high hopes.
I have only one question left concerning this political situation in Russia, what do you think will be the future of the Russian opposition after Navalny's death?
Predictably, all the political questions are, hard, and the answers are, not exactly hopeful, because, the problem with one of the problems with Russia is that we don't have a working political system, not a working democratic political system, but just a working political system, which reflects itself in the cultural field and in the way the societal relationships are structured. And so it means that we are not voting, we're not relying for or on a certain political program, a certain set of values. We are putting our hopes and our willingness for a better future, we're putting them, investing them in a certain figure. And this figure starts representing everything. And of course, when such a figure dies, you feel that all your hopes has been destroyed, demolished. So it will take a while for the Russian opposition at least to come back to its senses, to understand what is going on, and is there any way out of this situation? Because with Navalny, I did not agree with all the points in his political program, but he was this perfect exemplary political animal in all the possible senses. He was a person that looked like someone who is able to change the situation, to make a difference. And it would be hard for me to name even one person like that. There is a lot of people that I know and respect and admire, but leading the people to some major change is something different, and for now this field is empty.
Let me just pose one more question. Would you agree with the thesis that instead of seeing Russia as a democracy in the process of failing, we need to see it as an authoritarian system in the process of succeeding?
I don't see, you know what? I don't really see a huge difference, because it all depends on it all depends on one's own perception. If I want to see a country as a possibility, as something that has a future, I can call it a possible democracy, a future democracy, a flawed democracy, a failed democracy. But it is quite clear that it is not a democracy nowadays, and there was just a short period of time when it was trying itself out as a democracy in the 90s. But straight from the first Putin's presidential term, it was quite different. And then you can go and, elaborate on the spectrum of different authoritarian, totalitarian, and so on, despoty, and all the descriptions sort of fit and not fit. But, now we're getting even further away from the idea of democracy.
So in the book From the Other Side, Zone Strani, among other famous names you've mentioned before in the beginning of our conversation, you stopped by the name of the German writer Winfried Sebald, who speaks out against the tyranny of entertainment. Mm-hmm. Why did you choose him?
I chose him because I love his work, because his last novel, Austerlitz, it was the one I read the first, and it came to me as a revelation, because I was always troubled with let's call it the tyranny of interesting things. We are so keen, so excited about things that feel different and unusual. We call them exemplary, but the problem is that they are setting the examples no one follows. And so we're creating this climate of inequality, where we are dividing people into categories, the interesting people and the uninteresting people. And that is deeply troubling because, while not to speak of the fact that the majority of us are not that interesting, but we used to have a life, and this life was full to the brim of interesting or painful or troubling or beautiful things that we want to preserve. We don't want them to die. We don't want them to dissolve. But who cares about the lives of uninteresting people? The easy example, well, I'm an avid reader of biographies. And so let's say we're reading a biography of Emily Dickinson, for instance. And the first couple of chapters, of course, are dedicated to her family, parents, brother, whatever. And we're quickly leafing through these pages because we are eager to get to the real story, for the story to start happening, to move from all these dull people, boring people, to Emily Dickinson and her fascinating life. So fascinating and not so fascinating. And the non-fascinating people are, well, getting lost, forlorn, and forgotten. And it becomes even more harsh in our secular times, because in the old times you could hope for some idea of posterity, for an afterlife, for a beautiful heavenly future where all the souls would be equally visible and recognizable, for this kind of a egalitarian future of the dead. But it is not so in our times.
So what was really interesting to me, it was that this essay of Sebald you wrote a few years ago, and you wrote that Sebald was known as an underground classic in Russia, because not so many books of his were translated at that time. Now it's getting to change.
It is changing now, and I'm glad to say that, well, I don't know what is going on right now. I haven't been to Russia for 2 years, and but before the full-scale invasion, almost all Sebald's books were translated and published to a wide success. But an interesting thing is the first book of his that was published in Russian, the publication date was 2006. It was Austerlitz, and it passed practically unnoticed. Without readers, without reviews, the print run was quite small, maybe 300 copies, and it just disappeared. I was lucky enough, I just stumbled, following a friend's advice, I stumbled upon this book, and it changed my existence. And I think that, well, it sounds silly, but maybe if a wider amount of readers would be acquainted with Sebald's work, not that it could prevent the catastrophe from happening, but maybe we would be more aware of what we are doing and the way our thinking is changing.
Because you also wrote that in Sebald's world, nothing happens and salvation cannot happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that his work is a sort of salvation, a secular...
No, sorry, not cannot happen, sorry, cannot be expected even.
Salvation cannot be expected.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, yes and no. He is rather a hopeless author, which does not sound too exciting for the audience, I'm afraid. But the writing And the way he is treating the past is so beautiful that this hopelessness gives you a different start, a different turn. You don't need to be hopeful because it gives you something else. Hannah Arendt, in her writings, is advising us to give away, to get rid of the notion of hope, because hope is something that kills, because you are hoping for something and it fails you, and you're dying inside, and again, and after the second or third death, you're incapable of going further. And she's speaking about something, she coins the term natality, that means something different, an ability to start again from scratch in absence of any hope. And she thinks that it is a deeply human feeling. We are starting again and again regardless. And I think that Sebald has a kind of the same attitude towards the past and maybe the future.
Because he actually states that the worst has already happened before the beginning.
And is going to happen. If we have just 2 minutes, I'll retell a certain story. You're not going to find it in his writings, but he was telling this story in one of his last interviews that he had given a few weeks before his death. And he's describing a certain experiment with rats. So a rat, a medical rat, is being put in a tank filled with water. And there is no possible way of get out of the tank. So the rat is swimming and swimming and swimming. It is supposed to be holding at the surface of the water in order not to drown. And if no one comes to save it, if no one comes to save her, the rat is going to die quite quickly because it is exhausted and her heart fails. And maybe it also dies because of desperation. She understands that. That's it, and she just perishes. But the experiment is producing a miracle of salvation. So somehow a magic ladder drops, and the rat has a chance to get out. And it is experiencing this miracle. Actually, a miracle can't happen. We can't have hopes. So if the rat that has survived the catastrophe and the miraculous salvation is put into the tank again, it takes much more time for her to die because she does not allow herself to lose hope. And so hope is becoming an instrument of torture, a driving force for moving on and on. And postponing the death, but not saving you. And it is a, horrendous example. And I took some trouble to find out about, if the experiment really happened, where did he take the evidence from? And it actually happened. And it is a devastating but interesting, it gives you something to think about.
Sebald once wrote, "In my works, I have always tried to pay homage to writers with whom I felt a kinship, to take off my hat to them, so to speak, by leaving certain distinguishing marks in the text. It seems that you do that as well." Am I wrong?
Yes, I do the same, and sometimes when I am unable by certain reasons to give the reader the full quotation or a footnote, sometimes I'm just embedding some hidden quotations in the text, not in order for the reader to recognize it. It would be lovely if my reader would be able to recognize it, but it is my way of saying hello or paying homage to the writer, of keeping the conversation intact.
So let us hear some words of yours, and let's invite an actress, dramsko igralko Majo Konšić, to read a first chapter, a part of the chapter.
Ob koncu zime je na družbenih omrežjih zablisnila novica o neki najdbi. Po večletnih naporih in spodletelih poskusih so britanski arheologi le odkrili prostor zadnjega počitka Richarda III., grbastega kralja, ki so ga zaklali v boju, 10 globokih ran, razpolovljena lobanja. In na hitro zakopali pred 500 leti, so uspešno našli pod asfaltom avtomobilskega parkirišča in ga od tam izvlekli v čast eksaktne znanosti. In vse to prosto po virih, po kronikah, skorajda po Shakespeareu. Tu ne more biti napake, to je on. Mestu in svetu so predstavili vse, po čemer je pokojnik slovel. Krivo hrbtenico, do 10. leta je bil zdrav, znamenita grba, ki je izmaličila njegovo usodo, ni zrasla kar takoj. In široka bojevniška ramena in sledi udarcev. Razpoke v kosteh, v katere je bilo mogoče vtakniti celo roko. Še kar razmišljam o tem, da je večni mir še bolj nemogoč kot večni spomin. Preživiš svoje življenje, ki je bilo najverjetneje lahkomiselno, zamazano s čim sramotnim ali pa strašnim, ga blaženo spustiš iz rok ali pa roke nehote razkleneš in urejena zaplata spomina se počasi začne zaraščati. Otroci, vnuki, pravnuki se tu in tam še pokažejo, kje v bližini, potem pa se vse izravna z zemljo in zemlja vse prekrije. Ta misel mi je bila vedno v uteho in nima veliko zveze s posmrtnim življenjem duše, z njeno neulovljivo potepuško substanco. Misel, da samo sebe lahko snamem kot nahrbtnik, kakšno olajšanje, ali pa se obrnem kot list papirja, da so vse črke obrnjene na glavo. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Ta vrč sem bila nekoč jaz, mimoidoči postoj. In še zadnje, ničesar več ni, ki da utrujenim možnost, da se izgubijo do radostnega jutra ali kakorkoli pač že. A se ne bo izšlo, ne bodo pustili. Izvlekli te bodo izpod poljubnega kamna, te preiskali, identificirali, tukaj si. Svetili bodo s svojimi svetilkami in vtikali prste v ubogo hrbtenico, ki so jo prvič po stoletjih postavili na ogled. Pokojnik se je seveda sramoval in jo sovražil, se najprej skrival po kotih, potem pa šel med ljudi. Jaz, ki prikrajšan sem za čar oblik, ki me narava je ogoljufala in me prezgodaj je poslala v svet, pa še napol zgnetenega, nedokončanega, skaženega, da psi po cestah lajajo za mano. Ta posebnost ga je obsodila na to, da je postal eksponat. Mati zemlja, veliki izenačevalec, zadnji pristan, ga ni skrila, ni se mu uspelo povrniti v prah. Ta grozljiva nezaščitenost pred tujo zvedavostjo velja tudi za žive, a pri mrtvih smo lahko brez zadržkov. Nobenih skrivnosti, nobenih telesnih in duševnih tajn. Drznost raziskovalca se kaže v tem, da najde tisto, kar je skrito, ljubitelja to zanima. In tako razgali goloto svojega očeta, brez omahovanja nadaljuje pri bratih in sestrah, pri tistih, ki so nam bliže v času in o katerih se lahko spomnimo kar največ zanimivega.
Did you catch the main line?
I think I did.
So
The languages are
Yeah, so you...
related, but I know the text.
Yeah, of course. But you actually know from which essay is the part is taken.
Yeah,
From the essay?
against unloving, yeah.
Yeah, against unlove or unloving. That talks about or embodies your creative credo. Could you a bit explain it? for the audience?
That would be hard because it took me a whole essay to explain it. Well, I'm writing there about a certain kind of memoirs. I'm calling them garbage memoirs that are trying to catch a person they're describing on doing something small and nasty. And for instance, while I'm quoting a memoirist that is writing about Marina Tsvetaeva in her exiled Paris apartment, and the author is saying that the main feature of Tsvetaeva's small kitchen was an enormous garbage bin full of breadcrumbs, rotten vegetables, and so on, which is obviously a powerful image. It is not so easy to forget it. And so in posterity, lots of it is growing enormous. Lots of things are dependent on this harsh and unloving gaze of a spectator that might be not so well informed of Tsvetaeva's life or work, that might have nothing to do with the actual problems of her life, but just because they were acquainted and not too close, it gives this writer an aura of independency. So we believe too, people who didn't love the authors, the persons they are writing about. And we disbelieve the voice of love, as it happens with biographies, for instance. Who wants to listen to the wife? Of course she wants to hide something. That's what the wives do. But maybe she did know something about the way the writer's mind works. So thinking is being replaced by details, by biographical traits, by jokes, by anecdotes. And the main thing for me is, well, as simple as that, to be able to write about something, to be able to speak about someone, you're supposed to be loving her or him, at least to a certain extent. You have to have this potential for love, this investment of love. And it feels necessary for me when I'm doing my stuff.
Me, as a reader, actually, I thought about that you have a keen, after reading this book of essays, that you have a keen sense of how to preserve intimacy, which is actually increasingly disappearing in today's culture.
Could you elaborate a little bit, because it's very interesting.
You actually write against the logic of this indecent proximity that you were talking about in the sense of Marina Tsvetaeva.
Maybe. At least that is something that was quite important for me while writing these essays about different writers or thinkers that are included in this book, and also when I was writing a big book of prose. You can call it a novel, a memoir, a travel story. It is mixing the genres. The English title is A Memory of Memory, and it could be regarded as a novel that is, well, mirroring an essay, an extended essay. And the result of this, unlike the marriages, is the actual book. And it is a family story. I'm trying to recreate, reconnect, tell a number of stories of my relatives, of my family, from the late 19th century and to the beginning of our century. And the main problem for me was finding not a balance, but a voice that could be telling, writing about their lives, about their unlucky love affairs, about their migrations, about the humiliations they had to go through to write about them without telling the whole story, all the details, quoting the letters, but not exposing them too much, not making them stand up naked in the harsh light of posterity. And, that was important. And for instance, now it is sort of common to put photographs in the memory books. But I didn't include any images because it was important for me to save for them some level of decency, not to expose them too much, not to connect the stories with particular faces or hands.
And you've mentioned before this notion of garbage memoirs, that you're against.
Yes, but the open question is what makes the difference?
Yeah. I mean, you wrote, as I understand, that what really makes a difference is whether they are written with the eyes and hands of unloving people or not. So.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm still opting for this idea, yes.
So let us hear another part of this same essay.
Janet Malcolm se v svoji zelo dobri knjigi o Sylvii Plath čudi neuspehu ene od njenih biografij. Avtorici Anne Stevenson so očitali pomanjkanje objektivnosti. Očitali so ji, da, če rečem zelo nasplošno, ne pripoveduje, kako je bilo, ampak kako naj bi bilo po mnenju udovca, Teda Hughesa, znanega kradljivca Plathovskega kanona. Čudno, pravi Malcolm, kako nihče ne pomisli, da bi morala ravno različica Hughesa, človeka, ki je s Plath preživel vse življenje, njenega prvega in edinega sobesednika, bralce najbolj zanimati. A žal ni tako. V voajerskem svetu vednost iz prve roke ni cenjena. Prava roba je tista, ki se pridobi proti gospodarjevi volji. Gospodarji bralca spravljajo ob živce že zato, ker zapirajo dostop, najpogosteje s svojim telesom, do objekta njegovega zanimanja. Papirje zapirajo v arhive. Ariadna Efron do leta 2000, Brodski, kot pravi oporoka, za pol stoletja. Najemajo in odpuščajo pooblaščene biografe, medejo tekstologe, vztrajajo pri svojem, govorijo kot nekdo, ki ima pravico. To je res težko prenašati, sploh ker smo jih v svojih srcih že odsunili in ob krsti stojimo kot njim enaki, oboroženi z vednostjo, intuicijo, željo po razumevanju. Tisto, kar nam manjka in kar imajo v izobilju tisti, ki, kot se nam včasih zdi, lezejo v objektiv in zakrivajo tisto, česar nam nikakor ne uspe videti, pa je ljubezen. Smetiščni spomini se pišejo z očmi in rokami neljubezni. Dovolj velike, da lahko vzamemo v roke pero. Napajajo se iz nekogaršnje prepričanosti o vsesplošni nizkotnosti. O tem, da sta hrbtna stran visokega vedno sramota in posmeh. Takšne spomine je že kar prelahko prepoznati. Skoraj nikoli niso vsebinsko bogati in redko se zelo oddaljijo od postelje. Polni so vsakdanjih podrobnosti in prežeti z nepotešljivo željo, da bi se izkašljali, si končno dali duška. A tisto najpomembnejše, kar jih izda, je to, kako, kot v nočni mori, neprepoznavni so tisti, o komer govorijo. Kot pri Gerstein. Mandelstam prve knjige, Novo o Mandelštamu, si je včasih podoben. Mandelstam odvečne ljubezni je brezveznik, Mandelstam Nadežde Jakovljene pa je že čisto pravi papirnati hudič na vzmeteh, bazarski maver monostatos, ki ni dorasel niti eni svoji pesmi. Če želimo dogodkom povrniti izgubljeni pomen, je dovolj, da preberemo tekst, v katerem si je Mandelstam vedno podoben. Kratke in velike spomine človeka, ki je ljubil. Svetle Nataše, Natalije Stempel. Mrtvi se v ničemer ne razlikujejo od živih. Nanje se lepi vse. Tu ni nobenega zastaranja. Spomnimo se grbastega kralja. Osip Mandelstam je opazil prstan s smaragdom. Sedel k njej, prosil, naj mu ga pokaže. Ona si ga je snela s prsta. Osip si je občudujoče ogledal smaragd in nato prstan nadel. Sebi. Se je zahvalil dekletu in že hotel oditi. Ona je zahtevala prstan nazaj, on pa ji ga ni hotel dati. Rekel je, da mu je prstan zelo všeč, da mu pristaja, da ima do njega celo večjo pravico, saj da smaragd bolj ustreza njemu kot njej. Prstan se je vseeno vrnil k lastnici, ne spomnim pa se natanko besed V.A. Je moral vmes poseči dobri Max ali ne. To klasično, čistokrvno obrekovanje, ki ga je zabeležil sodobnik, odmev prastarega, zmivko zasipanega plažnega flirta, škrnicljev svojih mine damo, je brez zadržkov zapisano v komentarju k sveže izdanim zapiskom Olge Vaksel kot eden od primerov, kjer pesnik ni prikazan v najlepši luči, se pravi kot dokaz človeške malovrednosti Mandelštama. Sama Vaksel je o Mandelštamu zapisala takole. Zelo sem ga spoštovala kot pesnika, kot človek pa je bil precej šibak in lažniv. On pa o njej, kot vemo, takole. Mučen spomin je moj nate, plahota, medvedek, minjon, a v snegu spijo že mlinska kolesa, ohlaja se rok postiljona. In v takšni asimetričnosti, kdo bi si mislil, lahko najdemo uteho.
So we've heard, thank you, a few words also about Osip Mandelstam, and you're giving us also the story of a very unusual woman, Nadezhda Yakovlevna Mandelstam. Why does she fascinate you? I mean, it's a great essay.
Thank you so much. And I've been writing about her, well, quite a bit. And today we were visiting the Beletrina bookshop, and I was happy to see the book of her memoirs with the beautiful photographs. I didn't know this photograph.
Yeah, it was translated recently.
It is a wonderful book, and that's a rare case of, well, that is something that does not often happen in the world of literature. A person who never was thinking of herself as a writer or even as a creative person. She was seeing herself as a family member, as her husband's wife, a person whose main goal in life was to, after Mandelstam had perished in the Stalin's concentration camp, her main goal was to preserve his legacy, to memorize and to carry forward across the decades his poetry into the times when the publication would be possible. And after the poems were, well, put down and partially published, she decided to write a book of memoirs, then another one. And weirdly, this book had transgressed the usual idea of memory writing. It is maybe one of the first big books of documentary prose or of autofiction, mixing the genres, making you, live fictional and non-fictional at the same time. So it is a great book. It is beautifully written. It is as radical as it gets. And I have to say that when it was published in English, it opened the doorway for Osip Mandelstam's poetry, which is quite complex, but for a long, long time, I'd say that Nadezhda Mandelstam's books were more well-known and more resonant than Mandelstam's poetry. And that's a weird
Why would
trajectory.
you say so? Why would you say so?
That it was more
Yeah.
popular. That's figures.
I mean,
pure and simple.
it's a fact. So, but why do you think?
Uh,
Why it happened that way?
Well, because well, she was telling a personal story, but she's managed to transform it not only into a confession, but into the act of witnessing. It was maybe the first written account of the life of the intellectuals under the Soviet regime, but it was much more intense, much more dense, much more thoughtful than just a plain, straightforward report. So, of course, that was the main reason for the initial readers to be interested. But it is such a powerful book in terms of writing, and it does not get worse now when we know all the facts and all the information is gathered. So, yes, a beautiful and unusual way of writing that is much more common nowadays. But back then, it was a revolutionary thing in terms of prose.
So Nadezhda Mandelstam lived her life pursued and persecuted. After decades of wandering around the cities, she then lived in Moscow and was visited by Martha Gellhorn, another remarkable woman, the third wife of Ernest Hemingway, a writer and a journalist. I mean, it's really a remarkable story. Can you a bit explain this confrontation, this visitation?
It is a crazy story, and it is weirdly funny, actually, because it is a story of misunderstanding. As I've said, well, Nadezhda Mandelstam, as a writer, as a public figure, was much more visible at the West at the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s than her husband. And Martha Gellhorn was one of the readers, the first readers of this book. And she was so impressed. It is lonely, powerful, interesting, exemplary woman living somewhere under the Soviet regime. She wanted to do something for her without really understanding the conditions of her life or the real importance of this life and what it contained. But she wanted to go to the Soviet Russia and meet the lady. And they were practically, well, there is a small age difference between them, but Nadezhda Mandelstam was this little tiny grandma, babushka, in a cheap dress, and surrounded by an enormous circle of admirers that were trying to make her life better. And Gellhorn was this beautiful, blonde, towering figure, a war reporter, a celebrated journalist, Hemingway's wife, and in a way, a widow. She wrote about him a lot. So, two women somehow representing maybe the West and, well, whatever the Soviet Russia was. So the encounter was tragic and comic. And Martha Gellhorn wrote an essay about it that tells the whole story in graphic details, including the hardships she had to endure in Moscow when she was trying to buy herself some food, and there was no food, and it is this Buñuel-like plot, the modest charm of bourgeoisie. A group of people is trying to find a restaurant, and they're unable to do it. And something of the kind happened to Gellhorn. So it is a funny story, but the real nerve, the real meaning of it is this impossibility of understanding. They wanted to like each other. they wanted to get intimate, to understand themselves. But they were living in two different worlds, and it is so interesting to see the conversation as two different women that were conversing with themselves. It would make it a beautiful movie, I think.
You seem to be fascinated by like unusual strong women. Is it true? I mean, by reading your essays, I would say so.
Maybe, but I would make it maybe wider in unusual strong people, and while putting it further, maybe in usual weak people as well.
I was actually secretly referring to your own story because you once said that you were raised, that all the women in your family were raised by women, that the men were just side players.
In a way, yeah. That is funny because, my family story is a different matter, but when I'm thinking of it, I do see my ancestors as a row of big female figure, one after another, matryoshkas like, bigger, and a tiny me as the last one in the row. And luckily I have a son, so the story has changed. Yes, maybe. But again, maybe you had to stay strong to survive the Soviet era, the revolution and everything that followed. So weakness was a luxury, something you cannot afford. So they had to be strong, whether they were dispositioned for that or not.
You're the author of 12 collections of poetry, 3 books of essays, and a philosophical documentary book which is called Spominu Spomina. You have also received several literary awards, including the prize for European Understanding in Leipzig Book Fair. What actually do awards mean to you?
Nowadays, let's say, it should be the last one, last not the least, but they give me an opportunity to survive. Because, as we know, writers, it is not so easy to make a living with your writing, so, it is good when you have some additional means of funding. But with this particular prize, actually, I'm half joking, not exactly joking, but with this particular prize, there was something deeply important for me. It is the first, it is an old German European prize, and I know and admire all the writers that was awarded with it. But it is the first case when someone was receiving this prize for poetry. Usually it is prose or essays, different kinds of prose writing. And giving this prize to a poet for a poetry book collection, for me, was a powerful statement, meaning that poetry still matters. It still can make people, it still can change people, and by changing people, maybe change the world. And that was something that I'm carrying forward with myself as something to rely upon, something solid that I can place my thinking around.
Let me mention also the online newspaper. You added the online newspaper Koltaru. It's called the main daily Russian media in the field of culture and art. How well does this online paper stand nowadays?
It does not stand. It is lying face down. Not exactly, but it is getting close to that because, First thing, at the 8th of March 2022, it was closed down by the Russian state. So it means that you would be unable to open it from the Russian territory without a VPN. So we are sort of illegal nowadays. And the problem is that to be able to keep our independency, our editorial politics in the situation where all the independent media were getting bought out or destroyed or banned or whatever, we had to use crowdfunding as the main method for funding ourselves. And if you've lost your readers, if people cannot read you, obviously they cannot donate, and anyway, it would be impossible. I mean, the whole financial model would be impossible nowadays, and some of the members of the editorial team are still in Moscow, and so functioning in any normal way might endanger them. But we are, well, thinking of relaunching the website maybe under a different title and in Europe, but that's the matter of the future. But it was an important publication because for a long, long time it was giving you a big and diverse picture for what was going on, not only in Russia, but in a wider world. And what was important, we were reporting, we were publishing, we were interviewing the writers from Ukraine, from Belarus, from Armenia, from Georgia, and so on. And in the growingly nationalistic climate of Russia during the last 10 or 15 years, it was important. I do hope that we'll find a possibility of moving forward with this publication as well.
And my last question would be, do you believe in independent journalism?
Independent from what?
From all the obstacles.
Well, that's well, of course, I do believe in the possibility of independent journalism, but we have to define the term, because besides the obvious things, you can be and you have to be independent from the state if you want to be a journalist. That's the definition of the profession. But can you be independent from your own views? And if you, in your writings, are defending your views, does it mean that you are biased or not? How neutral you have to be to stay a journalist and not to become a poor publicist? That is a question. And another question, even more, well, troubling, is the way people are changing, trying to stay themselves, trying to stay independent, trying to keep on doing something in, let's say, in a totalitarian state. We've got lots of evidence, lots of writers, journalists, memorists that were witnessing and writing about the process as it used to be in the 30s, in the 40s. For instance, Czeslaw Milosz's books, or lots of memoirs about the Soviet times or about the Germans in the 30s. But unfortunately, and I understand that, well, it is only now that I've come to understanding that, unfortunately, you cannot share, you cannot use someone else's experience. You can take some parts of it. You can think that now you understand, that you know everything because you read, well, a dozen of books dedicated to the Nazi period, for instance. But after you've really been there, it does not become alive for you. And after you've been there, it changes everything. And I keep thinking of the journalists and writers that are living in Russia nowadays, and they want to get their work published, not because of the money, but because they want to address their audience, to keep it intact, to be able to converse everything that everyone does, but to be able to write and to be able to survive and to be able to get yourself published. They have to open their minds for an inner censor, for this invisible entity that actually destroys your mind, distorts your mind with making you make little invisible choices. Do I really want to write about that? Maybe I should save my courage for the next time, for the cause that would be more important, and so on. Should I publish this article? It is, well, again, not so important. Do I want to get my publication closed? And that is the choices people are facing every day, and they're getting broken, because eventually a number of people I know are really changing because of this thing that is happening to them. Some are, well, resistant, but the challenge itself, it gives you a different angle when we talk about independency.
Maria Stepanova, thank you very much for
Thank you
this
so much.
interesting interview. We'll wrap it up. Gledalke in gledalci, spoštovano občinstvo, če imate morda knjigo za podpisati, vabljeni na podij, na oder. Hvala.